A great many Americans did not vote for Donald Trump because they admired refinement, restraint, or philosophical depth. They voted for him because they had come to believe that Washington no longer belonged to them. It belonged to machines of influence. It belonged to donors, contractors, NGOs, consultants, lobbyists, bureaucratic networks, and professional moralists who spoke endlessly of justice, while ordinary citizens watched the border weaken, debt explode, and public money vanish into systems too complex to understand and too insulated to challenge. That is the heart of the story. Trump's rise was not merely the rise of one man, it was the rise of a political instrument forged by public disgust. He appeared to millions not as a polished statesman, but as a wrecking ball. Crude, chaotic, even dangerous at times. Yes. But in the eyes of his supporters, he was at least aimed at the right wall. That wall was Washington itself. A capital increasingly seen not as the seat of democratic sovereignty, but as a marketplace of organized influence. And in this interpretation, the Democratic Party did not simply fail because it had poor messaging or because it misunderstood working class anger. It failed because it became too intertwined with the very apparatus that people had begun to despise. It itself as the party of competent government, humane administration, and intelligent use of public power. But what many voters saw instead was a party presiding over porous borders, chronic debt, and inefficient spending while speaking in the language of elite management rather than national clarity. That contradiction became fatal. The border was one of the clearest symbols. A nation can survive argument about immigration, it can survive disagreement about quotas, asylum, legal migration, even amnesty. What it cannot survive politically is the impression that nobody is in control. Once the public begins to feel that entry into the country is governed less by sovereign decision than by drift, pressure, hesitation, and bureaucratic weakness, confidence collapses. The issue stops being policy and becomes legitimacy. People begin to ask, if the state cannot control the line at the edge of the nation, what exactly can it control? Then came debt. Vast sums, endless appropriations, trillions flowing through Washington. Yet for many ordinary citizens, life did not feel more secure, affordable, or ordered. Housing remained difficult, costs remained high, stability remained fragile, so a deeper suspicion took root. Perhaps the problem was not merely that government spent too little or too much, but that capital was being routed through a maze of interest groups and institutional clients before it ever reached the citizen in a meaningful way. That is where the argument hardens. The real issue in this story is not simply left versus right. It is sovereignty versus capture. The claim is that Washington has been overrun by professional influence, not always through cartoon corruption, not always through suitcases of cash, but through something more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous, a permanent ecosystem of organized pressure. Lobby groups, donor networks, legal advocates, contractors, consultants, and issue professionals do not merely advise government. They shape what government is allowed to imagine. They define what is respectable, what is fundable, what is survivable inside the Capitol. And when that happens, democracy starts to thin out. The citizen still votes, but the field of action has already been narrowed. The slogans may change, the faces may change, but the machinery remains. One interest demands a grant stream, another wants a regulatory carve-out, another wants labor inflows, another wants procurement contracts, another wants permanent program expansion, another wants legal ambiguity preserved because ambiguity itself sustains an industry of advocacy and administration. The result is not coherent self-government. The result is a state that feels busy, expensive, and morally noisy, yet strangely weak, where strength matters most. This is why Trump's appeal was so powerful. He made that machine visible even when he did so crudely. He told millions that the system was rigged, porous, decadent, and no longer answerable to them. He did not need to explain it elegantly, he only needed to name the feeling. And once the feeling had been named, millions recognized it instantly. From that point on, the Democratic Party was trapped. It could not effectively defend itself because its defense relied on trust in institutions and trust in institutions had already collapsed. It spoke of norms, process, expertise, and complexity. Trump spoke of betrayal, invasion, theft, weakness, and rot. One side sounded like management, the other sounded like revolt. That's why the argument eventually becomes radical. If the core disease is organized, influence, overwhelming the republic, then cosmetic reform is not enough. It is not enough to ask lobby groups to be a little more transparent. It is not enough to require an extra disclosure form or another ethics seminar. The stronger conclusion is that lobby groups should be banned from Washington, not regulated into slightly better behavior, removed from the center of democratic power. Because a capital cannot belong simultaneously to the citizen and to swarms of permanent influence brokers. It must belong to one or the other. If it belongs to organized pressure, then policy becomes an auction. If it belongs to the nation, then government has at least a chance of recovering clarity, discipline, and legitimacy. And so the YouTube story ends with a stark proposition. Trump did not rise in a vacuum. He rose out of the ruins of public trust. He rose because millions of Americans concluded that the Capitol had been captured. The Democratic Party failed because it became, in their eyes, not the remedy to that capture, but one of its chief political expressions. The porous border, the spiraling debt, the inefficient use of capital, the endless moral theater, the distance from ordinary life, these were not separate failures. They were symptoms of one deeper condition: a republic losing control of its own center. When people lose faith in the system, they stop looking for a manager. They start looking for a battering ram.